You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, mom, photographer, rock and roll drummer, and chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there.
Today is December 26th, 2021, and this is episode 153 of Lighthearted. In recent weeks, we've talked about some lighthouses in Georgia and South Carolina. I took a trip there in early November, and today we're going to hear another interview about a Georgia lighthouse. We'll be talking with Joel Cadoff, who is the Chief of Interpretation of the Fort Pulaski National Monument and Cockspur Lighthouse. First, has anything happened on the state lighthouse history, Michelle?
Yes, it has, Jeremy. Today's date figures in one of the most famous mysteries in lighthouse history. In the early morning of December 26, 1900, Captain James Harvey sailed to the remote Flannan Isles in Scotland to relieve the lighthouse keeper stationed on the island of Eilean More. When he arrived, he found the light station deserted. The three keepers had vanished without a trace, and they were never seen again.
The mystery of what happened to the three keepers at the Flannan Isles has been the inspiration for multiple books, a movie, and even an opera. There have been several theories about what happened to the men, but none of them can be proven at this late date. I plan to devote a future episode of this podcast to the Flannan Isles mystery.
Also, on December 26, 1891, the author Henry Miller was born in New York City. He once wrote, and I quote, "The world is not to be put in order. The world is order. Incarnate. It is for us to harmonize with this order," end quote.
So, Michelle, please help me tell our listeners about today's topic, Cockspur Lighthouse in Georgia.
Sure, Jeremy. Tiny Cockspur Island is located at the mouth of the South Channel of Georgia's Savannah River. An unlighted day beacon tower that was built on the island in the 1830s was converted into a lighthouse in the late 1840s. That tower was destroyed by a hurricane in 1854. The 46-foot-tall lighthouse that still stands today was built in 1856 on the old foundation. The tower is made of Savannah Grey brick.
When Confederate forces at Fort Pulaski fell to the Union in the Civil War, Coxburg Lighthouse stood directly in the line of fire for 30 hours. Amazingly, the lighthouse suffered no damage. Except for the Civil War years, the lighthouse operated continuously until 1909, when it was discontinued because of decreased maritime traffic in the South Channel.
The National Park Service assumed ownership in 1958. The tower was repaired between 1995 and 2000, and it was relit in 2007 with a solar-powered beacon. The lighthouse today is part of the Fort Pulaski National Monument. Friends of Coxburg Lighthouse was established to work with the National Park Service for the preservation of the lighthouse.
Today, Cockspur is one of the 5 surviving historic lighthouses in Georgia. The Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation put the Cockspur Lighthouse on the 2008 list of 10 places in peril. Major work was carried out this past summer, including the stabilization of the brick masonry and the replacement of doors and windows.
Joel Cadoff is the Chief of Interpretation and Visitor Services Public Information Officer at Fort Pulaski National Monument. His specialties are historical interpretation, the Civil War, and Seacoast defense history, and the National Park Service Historic Weapons Safety Program.
I visited Coxburg Lighthouse with Joel when I was in Georgia early last month, and I put together a little video you can see on the U.S. Lighthouse Society's YouTube channel. I actually got to climb the scaffolding up the side of the tower to the top. In fact, climbing up the scaffolding was the only way to the top of the lighthouse, because if you walk up the stairs inside, there's no ladder from the watch room below the lantern up into the lantern, so you can't get all the way up. But because we climbed the scaffolding, I got all the way to the top of the lighthouse, so that was fun.
You're brave. I don't know that I would have done that.
Yeah, well, I was there, so I did it.
Yep.
But it was fun. I had a tight schedule the day I visited, and there wasn't time for an interview, but we talked later using Zoom. So let's listen to my conversation with Joel Cadoff now. I'm speaking today with Joel Cadoff, Chief of Interpretation at the Fort Pulaski National Monument near Savannah, Georgia. I had the pleasure of spending some time visiting Cockspur Lighthouse with Joel just a couple of weeks ago when I was in Georgia. That was pretty exciting. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. My schedule was very tight that day. I didn't have time to do the interview at that time. So I'm very grateful that Joel is joining me today via Zoom. Thanks so much for being with me today, Joel.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Joel, you've been with the National Park Service for quite a few years. You don't have to say how many years, but I know it's been a while. And we actually met back when you were a ranger in the Boston Harbor Islands, I believe at George's Island, Fort Warren. I'm not sure how many years ago. It would have been in the 90s.
Yeah, probably 96 or 97.
Okay. So 25-ish years ago. Wow. Time does go by. So I have a two-part question for you. Where are you from originally, and what brought you to Georgia?
So I'm originally from Hull, Massachusetts, born and raised on the Boston Harbor Island. So it just makes a lot of sense that I would end up being a park ranger. And that's where I got my start. I mean, growing up and spending probably more of my time looking out the windows of the Jacob School in Hull, and then the Hull High School, looking at the islands and Boston Light and the Life-Saving Museum. So, you know, I've always been enamored by our maritime history. And at a very early age, I volunteered with the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands and at the Hull Life-Saving Museum. And I guess I just always fought wanting to do something else, but getting sucked back into to the islands. And I was a Boston Harbor Island ranger with the MDC at the time, obviously the Metropolitan District Commission, obviously now the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And from about 96 through 2001, I was a ranger with the Commonwealth. And then I ultimately made the jump over to the National Park Service, first as a park guide at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia at the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. And now over my nearly 20-year career, I've spent time on the East Coast, the West Coast, and I had an opportunity about 12 years ago to be a park ranger at a fort, which just triggered something from my childhood that, you know, I had a dream of being a park ranger at a fort again. So that was the opportunity, and it's been a wonderful experience.
I'm sure. Well, it's a great place. The Boston Harbor Islands are also a great place. I have plenty of experience with those, having lived in Winthrop, Mass. For a long time. The islands are a great part of Boston, but it was really neat visiting your area there in Georgia. I really enjoyed it. There's tremendous history around there, of course. So today we're going to talk mostly about the Coxburg Lighthouse, maybe a bit about Fort Pulaski. So the lighthouse that stands there today, Coxspur Lighthouse, is actually the second tower in that location, and built in 1856. And it's constructed of Savannah Grey brick. Could you tell me a little bit about what Savannah Grey brick is?
Sure. So for anybody that's listening and has a chance to make their way down to Savannah, when you're touring the city, you will see some amazingly beautiful houses from the antebellum area in Savannah. So Savannah Grey brick is a type of brick that is used in a whole number of different structures from the 19th century. And they were made on a plantation called the Hermitage Plantation, which now would be located somewhere around our kind of the commercial port of Savannah today. And so those bricks were made with enslaved labor, whether it was women and children actually making those bricks and then them being sent out. And then also for the fort and the lighthouse itself, also there'd be enslaved masons, actually putting these structures together. So there's a long history with these bricks, and really a special history here at the park.
I understand. I was at St. Simon's Lighthouse when I was down there, and that, I believe, is constructed of Savannah Grey brick, but it was constructed after the Civil War. So I was told it was constructed by formerly enslaved people. So I guess the production of Savannah Grey brick continued for quite a few years.
Yeah, up until about I believe the 1880s or so.
Okay. So let's talk about the fort a bit. Obviously, we could talk a long time about the fort, but this is primarily a podcast about lighthouses. But can you tell me about the bombardment of Fort Pulaski in April 1862?
Sure. So Fort Pulaski was built to protect the port of Savannah, and it was constructed between 1829 and 1847. It's part of a network of forts, including up in Boston, George's Island, Fort Warren, and Fort Independence. And when it was finished in 1847, largely sat unoccupied except for a few people, really an ordnance sergeant and a caretaker. But as the nation is breaking apart, as states begin to secede, Georgia leaves the Union. They'll actually take Fort Pulaski. They'll give it to the Confederacy when the Confederate States of America are formed. And as part of what we would think about as the Anaconda Plan or the blockade strategy of the United States Navy, the idea was to make sure to take Fort Pulaski back and to be able to shut down the port of Savannah. So the battle itself, after about nearly 50 days of siege and preparations for bombardment, will take place over 2 days, April 10th and 11th, 1862. Nearly 5,000 shots fired. Many of them are now new rifled projectiles that utilize that new technology to spin through the air with great power and accuracy. And the fort is ultimately breached during this battle. And it's the first time rifled artillery is used in warfare. And, it's really another nail in the coffin of these masonry forts of the 19th century, as they'll need to be improved. It's pretty interesting, though, to think that during this 30-hour battle, seeing a tremendous amount of iron flying from Tybee Island to Fort Pulaski, that the lighthouse was undamaged. It was lucky that it happened to be in a spot where any artillery would have to have a higher trajectory, so it would have flown well over. But in hindsight, would have been probably an amazing experience to witness the battle from the lighthouse itself.
I would say so, yeah. When I was there, I walked around the fort and saw how scarred the fort walls are, which is really interesting to see, because we don't have anything like that in the north with a fort that's so, full of reminders of the warfare that happened there.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was a ranger on the Boston Harbor Islands, one of my programs at Fort Warren was, what if Fort Warren was attacked during the Civil War? And it's the bookend to that now is that I'm working at a fort that actually had a battle, so I don't have to deal with any what ifs in this case. So it's
right.
I've always kind of chuckled at that, from my start.
Of course, Fort Warren had plenty of interesting Civil War history too, just different type of history, serving as a prison for Confederate prisoners, but we better not get into that too deeply.
Yep.
Let's talk a bit about the human history of the lighthouse, just a bit. I understand there was a tragedy in 1871 involving a lighthouse keeper's son.
There have been a number of cases where there has been tragedy going all the way back to the 1850s. But when we look at where the lighthouse is, in fact, you have the Cockspur Island Lighthouse, which is to the southeast of Cockspur Island. And then to the north of the island, you would have had the Oyster Bed Light Station as well. So you basically have these two towers marking the two entrances to the channels, the south and the north channel. And in these particular instances, you didn't have keepers actually staying in the lighthouses themselves. You actually had them living on the island near the fort before the 1880s. And, where tragedy would strike as they would try to get to these lighthouses and either be swamped, and where we've had drownings before.
Is there anything else, anything in particular that stands out in your mind when you think about the human history of Cockspur Lighthouse? Any stories or just something about the way of life of those people?
Well, one thing is, I would bring up Mary Mayer. She is our only female lighthouse keeper in the Cockspur Islands history. Her husband tragically dies, and so she is keeper for a couple of years. And she's keeper when the first tower is destroyed in the hurricane. After the next tower is built, she is let go. So it's, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with her. I wish we had more of a record of her time out here. if you look at the history of lighthouses and where women do play such an important role, not only as a support with the families that are potentially involved with these lighthouses, but having to step up and become lighthouse keepers themselves. So, to me, she is a somewhat heroic figure to even some of our staff out here. The lighthouses themselves, of course, we do key in on the waving girl who was out here as well. Florence Martis, who is the waving girl, she will gain her fame at a lighthouse further upriver on Elba Island, where she waves to the ships coming in and out of Savannah. However, she was born on Cockspur Island here at Fort Pulaski. Her father was the ordnance sergeant at the fort in the late 1860s. And her brother, George Washington Martis, he will actually become one of the keepers of the Cockspur Island Lighthouse. But as you walk around the fort, there are a couple of spots where he's actually etched his name into the stairwells, little historical graffiti, if you will. But I'd love to bring visitors up there because it allows me to engage not only into the lighthouse, even though you can't see it from that point, but to get into that human story, and also and I don't believe this happened during one of those storms, but during the Sea Islands hurricane in 1893, when we had nearly 5 feet of surge inside the fort, the lighthouse keepers, along with the ordnance sergeant and his wife, they actually huddled in one of the staircases for shelter, and they survived, one of these major hurricanes that impacted the South Atlantic coast in the late 1800s.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the waving girl, Florence Martis. As you said, she was not, didn't live at the lighthouse at Cockspur Island, although she, like you said, she was born at Fort Pulaski, but she was at the Elba Island, the light that was on Elba Island up the river, yes. Right? And I saw the statue of her in Savannah, and it's a story that I think a lot of lighthouse buffs are familiar with. Basically, what did she do? She waved to all the ships that passed the light.
Legend has it that she waved to all of the incoming and outgoing vessels as they would pass by the lighthouse
for more than 40 years, I believe it was, right? Something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, absolutely. There's we have a couple of images of her and her brother George at Fort Pulaski from the 1930s. There's one where she's on top of the fort with kind of waving a handkerchief, kind of reenacting, at least what she would do along the North Channel.
Oh, it's definitely a really well-known story. You mentioned the hurricane that destroyed the first lighthouse, the first Cockspur Island lighthouse, right? Mm-hmm. There were certainly other major hurricanes in its history. Do you have any comment on how the lighthouses stood through those types of storms?
Well, after the Army Corps of Engineers built the second structure in 1856, the current one, I mean, it's actually done rather well. It's got an interesting feature where it almost has a bow that seems to be able to split incoming waves as they approach. But the lighthouse was in relatively good shape. What there were issues with was actually living quarters. You can't live in these smaller beacons. The lighthouse is only 46 feet tall, and I wouldn't want to have to live there. Yeah. So originally there was a cottage just outside of the fort. Although if you look back in records, there are always complaints as to its condition. But in 1881, the one that was outside of the lighthouse was destroyed during one of those hurricanes. And eventually the keepers will set up living quarters in the casemates of the fort. Mm-hmm. They had several casemates that they could utilize. However, they themselves would also have to deal with potential flooding if the storm surges were too high. And really, by the late 1890s, they wanted to do what the Army was doing. The Army had built a cottage on top of the fort for the ordnance sergeant to live in, and they also asked for that to happen as well. And while they never built their own original structure, really when the Army finally left in, around 1904, 1905, they were finally given permission to utilize that house. And so the lighthouse keepers lived on top of the fort for, at least for the Cockspur Island lighthouse, about another 3 or 4 years before the lighthouse was decommissioned. While we're dealing with sea level rise, and since the 1930s, sea level has gone up about 9-10 inches just around Fort Pulaski. But with some of the modeling that's out there, that eventually we'll have to rebuild that structure, and we'll have a visitor center on top of the fort.
And the lighthouse will face some issues as in the coming years, it sounds like, too, being where it is. Yeah. So why was the light deactivated in 1909?
So a lot of it has to do with the importance of the channels. I mean, the Savannah River, if you were to look at a map, and you've got the Atlantic Ocean, you've got the approaches to Tybee Island, of course, you've got the Tybee Light Station and its first order Fresnel welcoming everybody to Savannah. But then once you actually got here and entered Tybee roads, you still have 14 miles of winding rivers to get up to Savannah itself. Yeah. And originally, the south channel of the Savannah River was deemed more important. However, as time goes on through the 19th century, the north channel will really become dominant, and that's our dominant channel today because of dredging. So more direct, a more direct line up to the city itself. They're able to, keep it at a depth that they can utilize, and they're going to use that one channel, and so they can just concentrate on that one as opposed to having kind of 2 different routes, because the river certainly would also be wide enough.
I understand there's a Friends group, a Friends of Cockspur Lighthouse organization, nonprofit. What does that organization do?
The Friends of the Cockspur Island Lighthouse, they are a nonprofit group of concerned citizens around Tybee Island and Savannah that absolutely adore the smallest lighthouse in Georgia. And going back to the early 2000s, the park was doing quite a bit of work with the lighthouse, but the citizenry really wanted to become involved. And so a number of folks right now, led by Harvey Farrell of Tybee Island, got together to begin looking at fundraising efforts and really trying to get more interest in the lighthouse itself, so we can continue to do preservation efforts. And it's because of them, and also because of the Tybee Island Historical Society, that we were able to do a lot of the work that we did this past summer.
And earlier on, I understand there was a really major refurbishing or restoration that was done somewhere in the neighborhood of 1995 to 2000.
Well, there were some issues with the lighthouse itself. One of them being that when the structure was built in 1856, for it to be where it is, it needed a stable foundation. And so there is a piling and grillage foundation. So basically what ends up happening is they drive wooden pilings into the muck and the mud until it will rest up against something harder, like an oyster bed or a sand layer. And then they kind of put this crisscrossing wooden platform on that. And that's what you put the brick on. And so it doesn't settle. That's what they had to do with the fort itself. So these structures are on foundations that are in great shape. But going back for the Coxspur Island Lighthouse, it's really more on a shoal, an oyster bed shoal. Mm-hmm. And some of that grillage was exposed. So those some of the top of the wood beams were exposed, and they had issues with shipworms, a mollusk that likes to eat wood, and certainly the enemy of most sailing vessels of the 18th and 19th century. Mm-hmm. So a project was put in to repair those issues and to help stabilize, get rid of those shipworms so that there wouldn't be any structural issues. A little later, there was some more work done with the painting of the lighthouse. Also, it was for a short period of time relit as well, more of on a ceremonial basis than an active aid to navigation.
Yeah.
So those were some of the earlier efforts. And as part of a new historic structures report that was done just a couple of years ago, we've been moving on, going back and looking at, whether it's repointing the lighthouse with the bricks, also having issues with the doors and the windows, because of course those are wooden elements, and being so exposed out there, there's been some maintenance issues. We've actually closed the lighthouse down. It used to be, when I first got here, you could paddle on over and you could walk through the front door. However, because of its age and because of some of the iron elements on top of the lighthouse, we needed to close that down to the public and really focus in on these preservation efforts.
You mentioned the relighting. I think that was 2007 from what I saw
Yep.
in a couple of places online. Some websites actually say it's an active light at this point, but as far as I could see, there's no light in there today, right?
No, not right. They're the remnants of a light, and at some point the park would like to kind of relight it on that ceremonial basis.
Yeah.
But there's still more work to do. But yeah, it definitely has not been working for several years.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And when I was there a couple of weeks or so ago, that was a lot of fun. You took me out to the lighthouse, and the scaffolding was still around it. And some people hate to see a lighthouse with scaffolding because they think it spoils their photographs. I always tell them it shows that the lighthouse is loved and being taken care of. So it's a positive thing. And we had the privilege to climb the ladder up the side of the scaffolding, which was very fun in a scary kind of way. But no, I really enjoyed it. I haven't gotten to do that too many times, so that was an unusual experience. And that enabled us to get right up to the lantern level. And we also went inside the tower. It was interesting to me to see that there was no ladder from the level below the lantern room up into the lantern the way there is in most lighthouses. So it's a little difficult to access that lantern. I guess you have to bring a ladder up there if you need to do that. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Even had we had the ladder, it would have been a precarious, adventure. It would have made it more special, I think. But it's definitely a unique lighthouse on so many levels. Where you go to even if you were to go to Tybee Island and to the Tybee Island Light Station, you definitely get such a different perspective on how lighthouses potentially can work, to even its view itself and its job that it has.
Yeah. Well, Tybee Lighthouse and St. Simon's Lighthouse in Georgia are spectacular, kind of majestic lighthouses, much taller. Cockspur's relatively small. I don't want to say it's a poor relation of those others, because it has tremendous history of its own. And I'm glad there's people that care a lot about it, but got a really interesting bunch of lighthouses on the Georgia coast. So if you could say a little bit more about what's been done recently. Again, there was scaffolding up when I was there, but it's down now from what I understand. The windows are gorgeous. I know the windows were replaced and they look really nice, but could you say a little bit about that and what other work was done?
Sure. So it was a couple of projects long in our hopper of things that we wanted to do over the last several years, but things finally came together. And the first project, and the one that really sets up the scaffolding, is a project to work on some deferred maintenance, which is really another word of saying, we've got some work to do here. We finally have the time to do it, and we're going to repoint the lighthouse. Our facilities team was out there all summer, also working with the Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, also known to us as TTAP, where we had professionals as well as interns kind of learning this traditional trade of how to properly repoint, especially historic brick, come up with mortars that are more appropriate to the historical aspects of the lighthouse. So for much of the summer, we had a crew out there from morning until afternoon, starting from the top, working their way down, and they repointed the entire structure. In some cases, they did replace bricks that were beyond repair. We are fortunate that we do have a kind of private stash of Savannah Grey brick that we purchased several years ago for the lighthouse and also for the fort.
Yeah.
So that took the longest amount of time. But also part of that project was replicating a new door and windows for the lighthouse. So now we're actually able to once again secure the lighthouse when we're not out there, again, to keep visitors, out. Unfortunately, we'd love to have it open, but there's still just too many hazards right now.
Yeah.
I'm just happy that we made it through hurricane season without any issues. Because when we put up the scaffolding and started the projects, kind of back in early summer, there was a lot of knocking on wood to get through hurricane season without any major issues. And fortunately, we did it. And the guys, they did a fantastic job out there. Yeah. And the lighthouse looks fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was impressed by the work that was done. And when we went out that day, one of the young guys who had worked out there on the project, I think his name is Mark, went with us.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, he was really into it. He seemed to love it out there.
Yeah, no, I would say, well, anybody listening, everybody gets sucked into lighthouses. We love lighthouses. But I would say even for those that don't necessarily have that just interest in I'm going to travel around and see lighthouses, there's just something about these structures, their history, their stories that, just suck people in. And whether that's the actual history or, with some of these guys that had never worked on a lighthouse before, didn't really necessarily care about lighthouses before, but, get personally involved. And now their blood, sweat, and tears out there of actually doing restoration work on there. It just continues that tradition. And it's just, it was amazing. We had a news crew out there earlier in the summer, and just to see the reaction of the guys and the pride in their work too, it's just really special.
That's really great. And they can tell their family and friends what's been accomplished there and feel very, very proud of that. You mentioned the shipworm problem before. I was just wondering, is that definitely a thing of the past at this point, the problem with shipworms?
I'm going to say yes, although I don't believe that we've had any exposure to any of those, of the beams of the grillage. Some additional oyster shells and riprap has been placed out there as well. Going back to, I'm not going to get the date right, but around 2012, 2013, the Army Corps of Engineers, they did place a riprap kind of barrier around, which we really couldn't see that day because of the tide being so high. But that's also helped with some of those issues out there. But I imagine, that's something that the park will probably have to look back at to see where we are 20, 25 years later.
So I felt pretty lucky to get out there to get a special personal tour of the lighthouse. Are there any plans for public tours in the future?
That's a great question. And that's something, I don't know that we've really discussed, like in the future, what we want to be able to do with the lighthouse itself, simply because it's rather on an exposed area and certainly wouldn't be open again to somebody to just paddle out. I would like to think that we need to address the iron on the railings that are on top of the lighthouse before we could ever allow anybody to get up to the top. Because those are definitely an issue. So I think there are still a few visitor safety things that we would need to deal with before we could say we can somehow reopen the lighthouse. But I know maybe in the future I would love to be able to lead some sort of program out there, because again it is such a great spot to go, even if it were ended up being a kayak tour ending out on the island. But we're still a few years away from that, I think.
It's not that easy to land and get off of there. As a matter of fact, I think we landed on the beach, and when we were getting off, the tide was much higher, right? We had to kind of climb down a ladder at the pier and jump onto the bow of the boat from there, right?
Yeah, no, it was definitely an adventure, and so any kind of visit needs a good amount of planning. So I think right now we're we're content at least of trying to keep folks off of the island simply because we would like some more oyster beds to be able to build up on the island and actually be able to support that area. And even that's difficult because we'll have kayakers that come out. They can't get into the lighthouse, but they're still trampling on those oyster beds as they're out here. So it's best to view it from a distance, which you can do from a kayak, any number of the dolphin tours, but even from Cockspur Island, we do have a trail that heads out toward the lighthouse, gets you the closest point, which is maybe a little over a quarter mile away.
So it's called the Lighthouse Trail, as you just said.
Yes.
And about how long do people have to walk to get that view?
So from the visitor center near the fort, so round trip is about 1.5 miles to get out to the overlook and back. So it's maybe about 3/4 mile one way.
Yeah.
We're in the low country, so it's nice, it's flat. The only thing you ever have to worry about are potentially tides like we just had king tides just a couple of weeks ago. Did a little bit of damage on the Lighthouse Trail because the whole trail was inundated. So it can get a little bit muddy depending on those tides, but other than that, it's an easy walk, and especially in the fall and in the spring, it's a wonderful walk.
I just want to ask you a little bit more about Fort Pulaski. When people come and visit there, what is there for them to see and do?
Obviously, we've got the fort. Fort Pulaski is a dominant feature, but as I like to tell visitors, it's more than just a fort. I mean, you can come out here and spend some time in our visitor center, learning about the fort's history, its place in the American Civil War. You can spend a couple of hours inside the fort, but we have several miles of trails that you'll be able to walk near the North Channel, be able to see the North Pier, and a spot where John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, actually landed here in Georgia in 1736. There's a concrete late 19th century gun battery called Battery Hambright as well, but lots of places to walk and to bike as well. So it's definitely a place where you can come for the history, but you can still, kind of get lost in nature and get lost in the marshes of the low country. It's a really special spot.
It is. Yeah. My wife and I walked around the fort and spent some time in the visitor center. I hope I can get back sometime and have some more time to walk the trails. It sounds really nice. We had a pretty tight schedule, but yeah. But
the two of you made the most of it. It was great.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you, and this one's for bonus points. All right. So my question is, what have you enjoyed most about your association with Fort Pulaski National Monument and Coxburg Lighthouse?
I'm still that little kid who grew up in Hull. And yes, the summers are warmer. Heat waves to us are much different than in New England, but I'm involved with a beautiful site with a tremendous amount of history every day. And I get to work every day at a fort and get to talk about a lighthouse. And that's stuff that I dreamed of as a kid. And I love to interact with our junior rangers that come out and give them the attention, give them the time that I was given when I was their age by a park ranger, hoping that either, hey, maybe they'll want to become a park ranger, or they'll want to become a steward and a protector of our national parks and our forts and our lighthouses, because obviously that's what we'll need as we move, into the future. We need to pass those torches, and that's probably my favorite part of this job, is just those interactions with kids of all ages.
I can understand that. Well, you've got quite a place there. You've got a fort and lighthouse with tremendous history. I mean, what more could you want? A fort and a lighthouse right next to each other like that. It's
perfect.
Yeah.
The only thing I would love to have is some United States life-saving service stuff. That would be the trifecta. But hey, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Well, you've got the beautiful natural environment as well, which certainly is a big part of it. It was a real pleasure visiting there. Again, I'd love to get back and spend some more time talking with you and walking the trails and everything. But it was a real treat being there, and getting out to the lighthouse and climbing the scaffolding was something I won't forget. And I really appreciate you spending some more time with me today. Thank you so much, Joel.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Jeremy.
To learn more about Friends of Cockspur Lighthouse, visit cockspurilandlighthouse.com. And to learn more about the Fort Pulaski National Monument, visit nps.gov/FOPU/.
Coxburg Lighthouse doesn't get the publicity its taller cousins in Georgia get, especially the lighthouses at Tybee Island and St. Simon's Island. But Cockspur has some very unique history, and I really enjoyed my visit to the lighthouse and Fort Pulaski. Joel Kadoff is a wealth of knowledge and a great ambassador for the site. I want to thank him for his hospitality and for the interview.
As always, we thank the volunteers, members, and staff of the U.S. Lighthouse Society and its chapters and affiliates. Check out uslhs.org to learn more about everything the Society offers, including domestic and international lighthouse tours. Memberships and donations help support this podcast, along with all the other education and preservation projects of the Society.
If you listen using Apple Podcasts or any platform that allows you to write reviews, please rate and review us. We haven't read any reviews on the podcast for quite a while, so I thought we'd read a couple today.
Someone using the name Mabs2224 wrote, "I'm only 17 and I knew nothing about lighthouses, but this podcast is so relaxing and interesting. I love Jeremy. I would totally recommend it if you're looking for a fun thing to distract yourself and relax with."
Wow. Thank you so much, Mabs2224. You saying the podcast is so relaxing reminds me of the time a woman slept through one of my lectures on a cruise ship. She was sitting right in front of me in the front row. She woke up at the end of the lecture and she said, "Jeremy, your voice is a cure for insomnia." But I know you didn't mean it that way, Mabs2224. At least I don't think you did. And I really appreciate your comments.
Someone called Siege On also wrote a review. "I'd always thought lighthouses were cool, but after listening to one episode of this podcast, I've come to have a deeper understanding and appreciation for them."
Thank you so much for the nice reviews. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more publicity the podcast gets. Also, please share the word about the podcast with your friends and family members who love lighthouses. All sharing on social media is much appreciated and encouraged.
Next week's episode of Lighthearted will feature an interview with Toby Smith about his plans to restore Paradise Island Lighthouse in the Bahamas.
This is the final episode of Lighthearted for 2021. We're recording this a bit earlier in December, just a couple of days before you're about to leave for a trip to Disney World.
Yes.
I want to wish you all the best for a great time at the happiest place on earth.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm really looking forward to this vacation. It's had to be delayed a few times because of certain things going on, but here we are, and I'm finally getting to go.
Well, I'm glad, and you deserve it. So enjoy.
Thank you.
Enjoy it. Enjoy the warmth too.
Yes.
It's getting mighty cold here in New Hampshire lately.
It's going to be in the 80s while we're there, so it should be
please.
Nice.
Well, bring some back with you, please. This episode will be released on the day after Christmas, and I hope everyone is enjoying the holiday season. We did 63 episodes of the podcast this year, featuring guests from Australia, 4 different provinces of Canada, Ireland, Scotland, Sweden, Norway, and of course, all over the United States. I continue to learn so much with every interview. We're entering the 4th year of this podcast, and I want it to go on forever. Thank you to all our guests, to the staff of the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and to everyone who's played any role in making our podcast what it is. And of course, a very important part of it all is our co-hosts. Thank you so much for co-hosting about half of the episodes, Michelle.
You're welcome. I really enjoy recording these podcasts. I learn so much each time I do.
Yeah, well, that makes 2 of us. So again, it's great having you on board for this ride.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I wish everyone a bright, happy, and healthy New Year. And as always, thanks for listening and
keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.